Sometimes you want to tell a person, what were you thinking when you did it? What was the logic of your actions? And indeed, sometimes people do such strange things that it is not clear what their purpose was. My wife cheated on me. Arch swiveled his chair to face the window. Autumn was in full swing, and the vibrant colors never ceased to captivate him. With a sigh, he turned back to his desk, picked up the newspaper, and took a sip of his coffee. It's still early, he thought. I'll just relax with the paper and finish my coffee. As he skimmed through the front pages, nothing particularly caught his attention. Then came the society section. Arch smiled, about to discard it, when something under the fold stopped him. There was a picture of Denise standing next to a tall, distinguished man. The caption read, "British nobleman and local woman announce their engagement." Stunned, Arch sat frozen. The paper slipped from his hands as a deep sense of loss washed over him. He buried his face in his hands, letting the tears flow. Archmeter wiped the tears from his eyes and glanced at the paper on the floor, wondering if he had really seen what he thought he saw. But no, the image on the paper hadn't changed. It was still a picture of his ex-wife with a tall man, both smiling for the camera. The photo seemed to have been taken at a party, likely the same event where the engagement mentioned in the caption had been announced. He hadn't seen Dee in over 3 years, but she still looked good. Despite the toll the divorce and her depression had taken, time had been kind to her. It seemed she had been trying to rebuild her life after the divorce. Unlike Arch, who had buried himself in work and avoided social gatherings for longer than he cared to admit. Leaning back in his chair, Arch ran his hand through his now mostly gray hair and sighed. The news hit him hard. He never truly believed he and Dee could reconcile after all they'd been through, but he had assumed that, like him, she might have held on to some faint hope. Clearly, he was wrong. Dee had moved on while he remained stuck, feeling sorry for himself. Never one to indulge in self-pity longer than necessary, Arch knew it was time for a long-overdue change. He picked up the paper and tossed it into the wastebasket by his desk. Finishing the last sip of his coffee, he resolved to start the day differently. He needed to speak with his assistant and secretary first thing. It was time to start delegating more and trusting his team to do the work he paid them for. It was also time for him to snap out of his slump and get back to being the man he once was. It took some time for Arch to delegate his workload to his team so he could feel confident that they were operating at full capacity, allowing him to begin reducing his office hours. He was proud of how his team embraced the new responsibilities he had given them, though he realized he shouldn't have expected any less. They were intelligent and well-trained, and, to be honest, he hadn't been utilizing them to their full potential before. That was going to change. From now on, Arch vowed, his team would be more engaged in the daily operations, and he would provide the leadership and guidance they deserved, as he should have been doing all along. A few weeks after implementing these changes, Arch was sitting in the cafeteria of the medical center where he worked when he saw his old friend, Bernie Green, walk in. Bernie had been married to Dee's sister, Deborah, for 2 years now. Had it really been that long? Arch waved him over and invited him to join. "Bernie, how have you been? How's Deborah?" "Great, Arch. Deborah's doing well, thanks. How about you?" "I'm doing all right, Bernie. Feeling better now that I've finally got my priorities straight. You probably know what I mean." "Unfortunately, I do. I've been worried about you. You've been overworking yourself for way too long. You don't want another heart attack, do you?" "No. One was more than enough, thanks. I've mostly been following my doctor's advice, except for the long hours. But that's changed now, so I'm sure he'll be thrilled at my next checkup." "I'm really glad to hear that, Arch. Deborah and I have been concerned about you." "Oh, really?" Arch said with a smirk. "I got the sense that I wasn't exactly on Deborah's list of people to worry about, especially after the divorce." Bernie had the decency to look embarrassed. You know how it is, Arch. Deborah and Dee are really close. Over the years, she's mellowed out and now sees that Dee was more to blame than you. How nice of her, considering Dee was the one with another guy between her legs, Arch said sharply. I'm sorry, Bernie, but even after all this time, her cheating on me after everything I did to support her still makes me angry. I get that, Arch, but I really think you should talk to someone about it. Holding on to this grudge for so long isn't good for you. Is that what you think I'm doing? Holding a grudge? I'm not, Bernie. I rarely think about Dee anymore. It's just moments like these when the conversation drifts to her, that old memories resurface. I loved her, Bernie. I loved her with all my heart. I thought we'd grow old together. When we found out her health issues meant we couldn't have kids, I was just as heartbroken as she was. But you wouldn't know that from her, or Deborah for that matter. For 12 years, I was the loving, supportive husband while she went through therapy, and then slowly withdrew from me. Did I ever tell you she screamed at me for trying to organize a 40th birthday party for her? Bernie's eyes widened. No, I didn't know that. Yeah, I was shocked, to say the least. But I apologized and never brought it up again. Still, our marriage only got colder. We were just two people living under the same roof, but there was no marriage. We might as well have been brother and sister for all the intimacy we had in those last 2 years. I did everything I could to bring her back to me, Bernie. I really did. But how much can one person do when the other isn't even trying? I was already questioning our marriage before the affair, so catching her with someone else was just the final straw. The only thing I regret is that it took a heart attack to finally snap me out of the fog I'd been living in for years. Arch's voice trailed off, drained by the conversation. His shoulders slumped as he stared at his plate, his appetite gone. Bernie placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder and squeezed. I'm sorry, Arch. I had no idea. Most people don't, unless Dee's told them. I never wanted to talk about it, still don't. But you deserved to hear my side, especially since I'm sure you've heard hers. I'll admit I have. But I always figured there was more to the story. There are two sides to every argument. I hope you won't get upset, but I have to ask. Do you still love her? Arch paused and took a deep breath, exhaling slowly through his teeth before responding. I've asked myself that same question. Do I still love her? If I'm being honest, yes, I do. We had some good years together, just not enough of them, and the bad years overshadowed the good ones. The thing is, even though I still love her, I'm not in love with her anymore, you know? It's more like I love her as a friend who's been away for a long time. I remember the good times, and sometimes I wonder what went wrong, but she's been gone so long that the feelings of being in love have faded. Besides, it doesn't really matter, does it? She's engaged now, isn't she? I remember seeing the announcement in the paper some time ago. Bernie smiled, thinking his news might make Arch reconsider his feelings for Dee. Well, Arch, I've got an update for you. Dee's changed her mind. She was swept off her feet by that guy, but when it came down to it and she realized she'd be living in England, she called it off. Deborah thinks she's crazy. After all, the guy was rich and he seemed really into Dee. He was heartbroken when she ended the engagement, but he accepted it. He's gone back to England now. Well, this changes things, doesn't it? Arch thought. But why should it? Just because she's no longer engaged, sure. That was the thing that snapped me out of my funk, but it doesn't change the fact that I'm done with dealing with Dee and her depression and all her other issues. She might be sorry about the affair, and maybe she's even better now, but for how long? She went through therapy and medication last time, and she seemed fine then too. Look how that turned out. Nope, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Realizing he'd been silent too long, Arch met his friend's eyes and replied, I'm sorry to hear that, Bernie. Dee deserves to be happy, and I was actually glad to hear she was moving on with her life. I really hope she doesn't give up. She's a good woman, if she's truly healthy, and she deserves happiness like everyone else. I thought you might want to rekindle things with her. now that she's not getting married. No, sorry, Bernie, but sometimes love just isn't enough. I used up all the love I had for her during the 12 years of our marriage. Besides, no matter what she says or believes, she couldn't have really loved me in those last few years. If she did, she would have asked for a divorce before having an affair. Bernie was visibly taken aback by Arch's words. How can you say that, Arch? Dee has always loved you. Come on, Bernie, you're the psychiatrist here. I may be stubborn, but I can't see any love in taking another man into the bed you share with your husband, especially in your own home. The least she could have done was take him to a hotel. But no, she didn't even have that much respect for me. She didn't care about bringing a man into our home, our bed. She didn't care about the possibility, however small, that I might come home and catch her with him. That's not love. It's total disregard for the feelings of the man you're married to. It's indifference. It's taking some twisted satisfaction in the risk of getting caught, however slight, and flaunting the affair. To me, that shows she weighed the odds of being found out, considered the consequences, and decided it wasn't worth worrying about. That level of disrespect tells me there was no love left. I'm sorry, Bernie, but it's over between Dee and me. Bernie leaned back in his chair, shocked. It was clear Arch had been reflecting on this for some time, and his conclusions, while painful, were likely accurate. Bernie had counseled enough troubled couples to understand how a man could feel unloved if his wife acted this way. Considering how much Arch had supported Dee through all her challenges and illnesses over the years, it wasn't surprising that he felt this way. He looked at his friend with empathy. I hear you, Arch, and I can tell you've put a lot of thought into this. For what it's worth, I agree. The actions you're describing don't show love for a spouse. In Dee's case, there may be extenuating circumstances, but only you can decide if those can outweigh the hurt you clearly feel from her betrayal. That's exactly the point, Bernie. Even though our marriage wasn't great for a long time, I never thought she'd cheat. I didn't even think she was interested in intimacy anymore, for crying out loud. But despite all the tension between us, I never imagined she'd hurt me like that. Seeing her in another man's arms destroyed any love I had left for her, and certainly any chance I could ever forget what happened. Throughout all those years, I was never tempted to seek comfort outside our marriage. I loved Dee too much, and I took my vows seriously through sickness and health. Dee needed me, and I was always there for her. Even when she seemed normal, I stuck around, hoping that the sweet, loving woman I married would come back to me, but that never happened. Even during the worst times, cheating never crossed my mind, and I had chances. I just couldn't do it. It wasn't right, damn it. It wasn't right. Arch's voice faded, and he slumped in his chair, emotionally exhausted. I'm really sorry, Arch. I'm glad you opened up to me, though. It explains some things I've wondered about for a while. You know that Dee was seeing me after the divorce, and while I can't share what we discussed, I will say that Dee doesn't fully understand why she did what she did, though I have my theories. Dee did love you, and she still does, but she realizes she hurt you. I don't think she even knows the full extent of it. I won't bring up Dee again, Arch, but I had to mention it. Deborah asked me to. She wanted you to know how Dee feels and still feels. Your choice to cut off communication, not talking to her or opening her messages, made Deborah think you were just being stubborn. Arch's head snapped up at that, and Bernie raised his hands in defense. I know that's not true, Arch. You're not a stubborn man, and after what you've told me, I get it even more. I wish things had turned out differently for you and Dee, but I understand your stance. You won't hear me bring it up again. Thanks for listening, Bernie. This is the first time I've talked about it in this much detail. I actually feel a lot better getting it off my chest. Bernie smiled at his friend. Hey, that's what friends are for, right? By the way, expect my bill in the mail. Arch chuckled. You know, with how good I'm feeling now, I just might pay it. He looked down at his plate, picked up his fork, and started eating. It turned out he was hungry after all. The conversation with Bernie did more than just put Arch's mind at ease. It made him reconsider his decision to avoid any contact with Dee. He had kept his distance to protect himself, knowing that if they had met, he would likely say something he'd later regret. He didn't want to hear her excuses for her actions either. What difference did the reasons behind the affair make? The fact remained that she had consciously chosen to bring another man into their home and sleep with him in their bed. As much as Arch liked Bernie, having to sit through the typical psychological justifications would have made him sick. Hearing Dee's reasons, or worse, learning that she had no real reason, as Bernie suggested, would have reopened old wounds and forced him to relive the whole painful experience, something he was desperate to avoid. So, to protect himself, he cut off all contact with Dee, communicating only through their lawyers. That, of course, was 3 years ago. Was it finally time to talk to Dee again? Maybe, but Arch knew he needed more time to think about it. A couple of weeks later, Arch was sitting in a quiet booth at his favorite new restaurant, waiting for his ex-wife. Since leaving a voicemail at her office inviting her to dinner tonight, he had questioned the wisdom of the invitation countless times. Did he really want to see her face-to-face in such an intimate setting? Would it send the wrong message? Would she even show up? Just as his mind spiraled with what-ifs, the hostess led Dee to the table. Always the gentleman, he stood to greet her. "Dee, thanks for coming. I hope you didn't have trouble finding the place," he said, pulling out her chair. As she sat down, Dee blushed, remembering how much she'd enjoyed Arch's company and how much she'd missed it over the years. "Thanks for inviting me, Arch. This is a lovely place. Is it new?" "Yeah, it opened about a year ago. I really like it. The food's great, and the tables are spaced far enough apart so you can have a private conversation without worrying about everyone overhearing." Dee wondered if Arch had something private to say. It didn't matter, though. She had her own reasons for being here, and decided to dive right in. "Arch, I'm so sorry." "Dee, please," he interrupted. "I didn't ask you here for that. I've had a lot of time to think, and I know you're sorry. The woman I married would be. And even though a lot has changed in our lives, I don't believe you've changed that much." "Thanks for believing in me, Arch. You're right, we've both changed a lot, before and after the divorce. I just want you to know that I take full responsibility for everything." "I appreciate that, Dee, but I don't want, and I don't need, an explanation about what happened that led to the divorce. I've made my peace with it, and I don't want to reopen old wounds. That's not why I invited you here." "I still feel like I owe you an explanation, Arch." "Please, Dee," he said, sharper than he intended. Taking a breath to calm himself, he continued. "I don't want an explanation. That's in the past, and we both need to leave it there. We can't keep living in what happened. That's why I asked you here tonight. I want us to be friends again." "Yes, Dee, just friends. We've spent many years together, and while not all of them were great, some were, and there's no reason two people with our history can't be friends. I probably shouldn't have cut you off like I did, but I can't change the past. All I can do now is try to make things right moving forward. Can we be friends again, Dee?" Arch leaned back and waited for her response. Dee looked down at her plate, then peered up at Arch through her lashes. Her eyes held a hint of tears, and her throat felt constricted. She never expected Arch to say those words to her. She had thought her chances of reconnecting with him were gone due to her past actions, and now being offered friendship was more than she could have hoped for. She swallowed a couple of times to clear her throat before she could reply. "I'd really like that, Arch. I would love for us to be friends. I hoped for this, but I never thought it would actually happen. I'm so pleased you've extended this offer to me. I'm overwhelmed but flattered. I guess I'm more of a monster than I realized if you feel this way. I've never stopped loving you, Dee, but I'm no longer in love with you. I hope we can build a new relationship as good friends." "I appreciate your feelings, Architect. Even though my actions might not reflect my emotions, I've never stopped loving you either. I also want to start a new relationship with you as very good friends." She noticed that Arch had already poured wine before she arrived, so she picked up her glass to make a toast. To good friends? Arch raised his glass and smiled. To good friends. They clinked glasses, took a sip of wine, and then picked up their menus, settling into conversation. Despite not having spoken for 3 years, their conversation soon flowed as comfortably as it used to before their marital troubles. Before long, dinner and dessert were over, and it was time to go home. Arch pulled out Dee's chair and took her hand. I had a really nice time, Dee. I was pretty nervous, to be honest. I thought the evening would be awkward, and it was for a bit, but once we settled in, it felt almost like old times. May I walk you to your car? Dee smiled and squeezed Arch's hand before letting go. Thank you, kind sir. I was worried about how the evening would go too, but I'm glad I took the chance. Thanks for offering your friendship, Arch. I'll always cherish it, just as I will your friendship. Arch walked Dee to her car and waited until she started the engine before heading to his own vehicle, reflecting that the evening had turned out well. Arch sat in his chair at the board meeting, lost in thought. Mr. Joseph Joe Brambley, the CFO, was retiring and reminiscing about his years at the medical center. Although Arch had always liked Joe, who tended to be quite talkative, today he was particularly verbose. Joe was droning on about his career and the remarkable people he'd worked with, and by the time he reached the 1960s, Arch was struggling to stay awake. He forced himself to pay attention, but fortunately, thanks to the CEO, Joe wrapped up his nostalgic speech quickly. Everyone applauded Joe for his contributions, and he received a standing ovation from his colleagues. The next item on the agenda was introducing Joe's successor. Although Arch had participated in the initial interviews and the subsequent rounds for the candidates, he was not aware of the final selection. The CEO, Bill Corrigan, had kept the final choice to himself after reviewing his team's recommendations. All 3 candidates were highly qualified. One had even been a CFO at a smaller regional health center. Arch had no reservations about any of them, so he wasn't worried about Bill's decision. However, if asked for his personal opinion, he would vote for the only female candidate, Elizabeth Cann. Elizabeth's qualifications were on par with the other applicants, and she had interviewed well, demonstrating confidence in her skills and ideas. She presented some innovative cost containment strategies, a crucial issue in the healthcare sector. What particularly impressed Arch was her intelligence. During their last formal interview, while chatting before her next appointment, he found her quick wit refreshing. He hadn't enjoyed a conversation with a woman this much in years. It also helped that Elizabeth had an understated attractiveness. She seemed to be around his age, between 45 and 50, with naturally dark black hair, a rarity for someone her age. She was fairly tall, slightly shorter than him in heels, and had a curvy yet average figure. Her smile was what truly caught his eye. She smiled easily and often, but never in a frivolous way. To Arch, she appeared to be an excellent fit for their current team. Arch's thoughts were interrupted by Bill's announcement, which everyone had been eagerly anticipating. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to express my gratitude for your input in helping me decide on Joe's replacement. I also want to thank Joe once more for his generous offer to stay an additional month and be available for consultation for 3 months to assist his successor in settling into their new role. Joe received a round of applause, which he acknowledged with appreciation, before Bill continued. Selecting Joe's replacement was a challenging task, but it was not due to a lack of effort on your part. The difficulty stemmed solely from the high caliber of the candidates. I didn't want to reject any of them. However, a decision had to be made. So, without further delay, please welcome our new CFO, Elizabeth Cann. Elizabeth, who had been waiting in the adjacent office for her cue, stepped in and took in the scene. She had worked diligently for this position and was eager to take on the challenge she was confident she could handle. She had long aspired to work at the Center City Medical Center, renowned for its premier status in the state. Known for hiring the best in the industry, Elizabeth believed she was among the best and was determined to make a significant impact here. On a personal level, if she were honest with herself, she was quite pleased to be working with Arch Meter. Among all the interviews she had, his was the one she enjoyed the most. Moreover, she found him to be a very attractive, quick-witted, and pleasant conversationalist. She was certain she would thoroughly enjoy this job. "Thank you, Bill. I want to express my gratitude for selecting me as your new CFO, and I look forward to working with Joe and learning everything I can from him." Turning directly to Joe, she added, "Joe, I want to thank you in advance for your time, and I promise I'll pick your brain so thoroughly you'll have a headache when we're done." Joe and the rest of the staff laughed at her comment. She then took the chair Bill had indicated and settled in. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind you that Joe's retirement party is this Friday evening at the Hilton at 8 p.m. It's a formal event, so dress in your best attire and get ready for an evening of dining and dancing. This meeting is adjourned." Bill's staff began to leave the room, taking a moment to shake hands with and congratulate Elizabeth on her new role. Arch lingered, making sure he was the second-to-last person to depart. "Congratulations, Elizabeth. Welcome to the team. I'm really looking forward to working with you. Feel free to pick my brain any time. My door is always open." "Thank you, Arch. I'll definitely do that. I'm sure we'll be working closely together in the future, and I'm looking forward to it." She smiled and made eye contact with Arch as she spoke. "Me too, Elizabeth." Arch shifted a bit nervously, but pressed on. "If you don't mind me being a bit forward, would it be all right if I escorted you to the retirement party? Since you're new in town and all." Wow, he doesn't waste any time, Elizabeth thought. If it were anyone else, I'd probably decline, but I have a good feeling about Arch. I'm curious to see what he's planning. "Thank you, Arch. I'd be delighted. I haven't had much of a chance to get my bearings, so your offer is greatly appreciated." "Great. We can finalize the details later this week. I'm sorry, but I have a meeting to attend now. I'll talk to you later." With that, Arch left the room, leaving Elizabeth and Joe alone. "Arch is an excellent guy. He'll be very helpful to you in the future. How about we go to my office? Sorry, I mean your office, and meet the team." Elizabeth smiled and gave Joe's arm a reassuring pat. "Joe, it's still your office and your team, and I don't want you to think otherwise. I'm truly excited about working with you over the next few weeks. You have an outstanding reputation in our field, and I'm eager to learn from you so I can better myself. Just focus on making this medical center the best it can be, and do so with integrity, and you'll succeed. That's what I've always done, and it's worked well for me. I'm sure it will for you too." With that, they headed to Joe's office for her first meeting with her new team. The retirement party was a tremendous success. Joe and his wife relished the attention and praise from his colleagues throughout the evening, and the room was filled with emotion when Joe expressed his gratitude for the wonderful years they had shared. Thanks to his investments, Joe and his wife were set to embark on a world cruise the following month, something they had dreamed of for years. Joe mentioned that he would be available for consultation upon his return if needed, though he didn't expect that to be the case. During the week they had worked together, Elizabeth had adapted to the role like no one else Joe had ever known. He planned to start stepping back and letting her take the lead starting Monday. He assured Bill that this transition would be smooth, and Bill seemed satisfied with this, noting that his instincts had always served him well. Bill observed that his new CFO and COO were getting along splendidly. They had been chatting and laughing easily throughout the evening and even dancing together, though Elizabeth also danced with other team members, as did Arch. It was pleasing to see his staff interact so well in a social setting. However, Bill wasn't oblivious. He noticed the beginning of a spark between Elizabeth and Arch. Elizabeth was an attractive woman, and Arch was a handsome man. Together they made a lovely couple. Bill was actually pleased to see Arch looking so happy tonight, especially since he had been rather subdued since his divorce. He wasn't the same Arch he had known since the divorce. He had become a man who was withdrawn from others, avoiding interactions outside of a business context. Rather than socializing, Arch had immersed himself in work, though this pattern had recently begun to change. Bill had even tried to spark Arch's interest in social activities by ensuring there were eligible women at company events, but none seemed to catch Arch's eye. Then, 5 or 6 months ago, Arch appeared to snap out of his rut and started to return to his former self. Some careful investigation revealed that Arch and his ex-wife had reconciled and decided to be friends again. Although Bill, like Arch's other friends, had hoped for a full reconciliation between Arch and Dee, it was clear that this wouldn't happen. Bill had a good idea why, but never pushed the issue, content that they had managed to move past their deadlock of the past 3 years to establish a friendship. While he wasn't sure if Elizabeth would be the ideal match for Arch, he would need to get to know her much better before making that judgment. It was encouraging to see Arch showing interest in a woman again. He would need to keep an eye on this emerging romance to ensure that if things went awry, it wouldn't negatively impact his team. The last thing he wanted was to lose one or both of them due to an inability to work together. However, it was too early to worry about that. After all, attending a party and sharing a few dances didn't constitute a romance just yet. Elizabeth smiled at her escort as they neared her apartment. "Thank you for accompanying me to the party tonight, Arch. I had a great time, and you're an excellent dancer." "You're welcome, Elizabeth. You were great, too. You really impressed everyone tonight. I kept hearing nothing but positive things about you. You certainly didn't come across as the new person," Arch replied with a grin. "I don't know what it is, but I feel so at ease here, with my team and Bill's staff. It feels like we've been working together for years. The spouses of the other officers are so welcoming and supportive, it's almost like one big family." Bill encourages that kind of atmosphere and carefully selects his people to fit that mold. It creates a much better work environment. Of course, Bill can be strict when necessary, but he probably needs to do so less often than many CEOs because he's so thoughtful in his hiring, Arch said, noticing they had reached her door. He took a step back. "Well, here we are. Thanks for letting me escort you tonight, Elizabeth. I'll see you Monday." Elizabeth inserted her key into the lock and opened the door slightly. "No, Arch, thank you. I had a wonderful time and appreciated your company. See you Monday." She then stepped into her apartment and closed the door. Months passed, and Elizabeth seamlessly took on her role as CFO, just as Joe had anticipated. She expanded on Joe's foundation, implementing numerous policy changes that boosted the corporation's profits while preserving the company's esteemed standards. During this time, Elizabeth and Arch developed a friendship due to their close working relationship. They would have lunch together a couple of times a week and often dine together after long work days. Their conversations mostly centered around work, but, as often happens, personal details gradually surfaced. Arch learned that Elizabeth had been divorced for 10 years, while he shared that his own divorce had occurred almost 4 years ago. He was surprised to discover that Elizabeth had no children, as her ex-husband hadn't wanted any, whereas he mentioned his own lack of children but didn't go into detail. As Arch had noted during their interviews, they shared many common interests. He felt very at ease with her. Although he didn't think he was in love with her the way he had been with Dee when they first met, he genuinely enjoyed her company and looked forward to their time together. Elizabeth, however, wondered what was holding Arch back. While he seemed happy and thoroughly enjoyed her company, their relationship remained platonic, with no dates or romantic gestures, only friendly gatherings. Initially, she thought he might be hesitant to date a colleague for fear it could affect their professional performance if things didn't work out. She even considered whether there might be a policy against such relationships for company officers and consulted the human resources director, who confirmed that no such policy existed. After some time, Elizabeth learned from her colleagues that Dr. Bernie Green was as close to Arch as anyone, making him the ideal person to ask for insights into Arch's situation. One day, she saw Bernie alone in the cafeteria and decided to approach his table. "Dr. Green, may I join you?" Elizabeth asked. Bernie Green looked up to see the tall brunette he recognized from her association with Arch standing at his table. He rose and gestured to the vacant chair. "Please have a seat, Ms. Can. I don't believe we've met before." "I'm flattered you know who I am," Elizabeth replied. "Your reputation precedes you, Ms. Can. Everyone's been talking about the new CFO and her innovative ideas." Elizabeth smiled modestly. "Please call me Elizabeth. I had no idea my reputation had spread so widely. It's nice to hear, though. I enjoy being recognized for my work. I hope I'm not coming off as too self-centered." "Not at all. And please, call me Bernie. As Walter Brennan once said on an old TV show, no brag, just fact. You've earned your accolades, and in my opinion, you deserve every bit of praise." "I remember Walter Brennan, though I don't think I ever saw that show. I appreciate your kind words, Bernie. Everyone here is so welcoming, and you certainly continue that tradition." Bernie sensed there was more to this meeting than mutual praise, and decided to get to the point. "While it's been nice exchanging compliments, I have a feeling you wanted to discuss something else. Am I right, Elizabeth?" Elizabeth looked slightly embarrassed and said, "Was I that obvious, Bernie?" "I wanted to discuss something with you. Actually, someone. Arch Meter. I've heard you're his closest friend here, so I was hoping you could provide some insight. I'll help as much as I can, but there are some things I can't discuss due to doctor-patient confidentiality." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "Arch was a patient?" "No, his ex-wife Dee was. But I have a feeling your questions might involve details related to Dee, and I can't go into specifics about that." "I understand, Bernie. Since you know why I'm here and what I'm interested in, I'll be direct. I like Arch, but he seems to be holding back. We're good friends, at least I think we are, but I'd like to be more than friends. He's not exactly reluctant, but he's not picking up on my signals to move forward. Can you provide any insight?" Bernie took a moment to consider Elizabeth's comments. He needed to be cautious. While he hoped Arch would find someone new, as a reconciliation with Dee was not an option, he didn't want to disclose sensitive information. "I'm sorry if I seem hesitant, Elizabeth, but this is a delicate issue. Arch is a close friend, but so is his ex-wife. I don't want to hurt either of them, and what you're asking could be damaging if not handled carefully. Before we proceed, I need you to promise that nothing we discuss today will be shared with anyone, including Arch." Elizabeth reached over and gave Bernie's arm a reassuring pat. "I completely understand, Bernie, and I promise I won't share anything you tell me in confidence. I value any insights you can provide, but I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. If there's anything you need to leave out, that's perfectly fine." "All right then. I think Arch is hesitant to get too involved with any woman, not just you, because he still has unresolved feelings for his ex-wife. He's told me directly that he isn't in love with her anymore, but they were married for 20 years, and such strong feelings take time to overcome. Their marriage had its issues, which led to their divorce, but the end came so abruptly that Arch didn't have the chance to adjust to life without Dee. For the first 3 years post-divorce, he was a workaholic, isolating himself from social activities. It's only been in the last 6 months or so, just before you joined the company, that Arch and Dee have started talking again. They've agreed to be friends, and it's working out well for both of them. So, in a way, Arch has only been divorced for 6 months, and he might not be ready or even seeking a new relationship just yet." "That makes a lot of sense now. Arch's behavior is clearer to me. When he mentioned being divorced for almost 4 years, I thought he would be mostly over it by now. He must have really loved his ex." Yes, he did. For the first 8 years of their marriage, they were one of the happiest couples I've ever known. The problems started gradually, but Arch, who deeply values marriage, was determined to make it work. For the next 12 years, they had many ups and downs, more than most couples, but Arch remained committed and tried to improve the marriage. It's not all Dee's fault. She had her own issues which I can't delve into, but Arch loved her so much that he endured many difficulties to keep their marriage intact. Ultimately, something happened that Arch couldn't accept, and they divorced. The bottom line is, he still cares for her but isn't in love with her. They seem to have a good friendship now, and considering the circumstances, that's a significant step forward for them. Elizabeth took in what she had been told. Arch's behavior, or rather his lack of action, made much more sense now. Bernie had addressed several of her concerns, the main one being her worry that Arch might only see her as a friend. While she was still unsure if Arch was genuinely interested in more, she now understood that he might be hesitant to pursue a new romantic relationship while handling his divorce. Having been divorced for over a decade herself, and having no interest in the other men she had met, she decided to give Arch the time he needed and see how things developed. Thanks for the insight, Bernie. I really appreciate it. I want you to know that I won't mention our conversation to anyone, and you've definitely eased my mind regarding Arch. If you don't mind, I'd love to have lunch with you again. Not to discuss Arch, but to thank you for today. My treat. Bernie grinned broadly. You're on, Elizabeth. I may be married, but I can't refuse lunch offered by a beautiful woman. Weeks turned into months, and Arch and Elizabeth's friendship grew stronger. Arch began inviting Elizabeth to numerous company events, to the point where his colleagues assumed they were a couple. At one of these gatherings, the company picnic, Bill said something that made Arch start thinking. So, Arch, how's it going with you and Elizabeth? I can't tell you how happy I am to see you interested in someone after all this time. Arch was puzzled by Bill's comment, and his confused look prompted Bill to explain further. Come on, Arch. It's no secret. We can all see that you're smitten with Elizabeth. I think it's great. You two make a wonderful couple. Bill, I think you might have misunderstood. Elizabeth and I are just good friends, nothing more. Arch, it's me you're talking to. I notice how you behave around her. Even now, you know exactly where she is, and when your eyes meet, your faces light up. I've seen the way she looks at you when she thinks you're not watching. And whether you admit it or not, you have that same look, though maybe a bit less intense. You two are a great match, and I hope it works out for you. Anyway, we'll chat more later. I have to go man the dunk tank. It's my turn. Is he right? Arch wondered. Do I really act that way? To test his feelings, he scanned the area for Elizabeth, almost instinctively knowing where she would be. When he found her, he watched until their eyes met, and as Bill had said, Elizabeth's face brightened. Her smile was more vibrant than when she was talking to her friend. Arch couldn't help but notice that his own mouth was curving into a smile, and his heart swelled with her attention. My God, Bill's right. I do react to her as she does to me. How did I not see this before? If Bill is correct, and I have no reason to doubt him, everyone thinks we're a couple except for me. I wonder how long Elizabeth was going to let me stay in the dark before saying something. Not one to delay, Arch decided to talk to Elizabeth about her feelings and his own. He approached her, where she was chatting with one of her staff members, a pretty young girl whom Elizabeth was mentoring. Hello, ladies. Joy, are you enjoying the picnic? Oh, yes, architect. Elizabeth and I were just talking about how much fun we're having. We're planning to join the three-legged race later today. I'll be sure to cheer you on to victory then. Arch turned to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, could we have a private word? Elizabeth excused herself from Joy, and together they walked to a quiet table away from the crowd. Elizabeth looked at Arch with concern, noting his serious demeanor. Is something wrong, Arch? No, nothing's wrong, Elizabeth. Bill and I were talking, and he mentioned something that made me realize I might have been a bit oblivious about us. Oblivious? What do you mean, Arch? He congratulated us on being a couple, and I didn't understand what he meant at first. He gave examples that led him to that conclusion, and after our conversation, I checked and found out he was right. Elizabeth was curious, but hoped it was leading where she wanted. What did he say? He pointed out how you and I have a certain look when we see each other, and how we almost instinctively know where the other person is when we're apart. I tested it out, and he was right. I didn't know your exact location on the grounds, but I found you quickly because I felt like I sensed you. When our eyes met, your smile widened, and your eyes sparkled. I felt my own smile grow and a warmth in my chest at that moment. Arch paused, holding her hand. Elizabeth, am I right? Do you have feelings for me as deeply as I seem to have for you, even if I was too thick-headed to realize it? Elizabeth's heart melted at the look of love in Arch's eyes. It seemed that Arch was finally acknowledging his feelings. She'd have to thank Bill later for nudging this along. Yes, Arch, I care for you very much. I've been hoping you'd realize it too, and I'm so glad you have. I didn't want to rush things because I wanted us to get to know each other better as friends first. As we grew closer, I sensed our relationship developing into something more, even if we didn't admit it. It's happened gradually, and I've been patiently waiting for you to catch up. Seems like the man is always the last to know, huh? In this case, I guess that's not a bad thing. So, what's next? How about a proper date? Dinner tomorrow night with dancing afterward? How does that sound? Elizabeth smiled warmly. That sounds wonderful. Is 7:30 okay for you? I need to get a new dress. That works for me. Now, how about we head over to the playing field and get you ready for that race? Arch sat in his study, reflecting on his upcoming date. He was eagerly anticipating the evening. It was remarkable how quickly he had adjusted to this new situation, considering that just yesterday he saw Elizabeth as nothing more than a good friend. How had he overlooked the feelings that now seemed so clear? Was he so emotionally detached that he could develop an attraction to someone as lovely as Elizabeth without realizing it? According to Bill, he had been acting like he was part of a couple for quite some time, even though he hadn't been aware of it. Perhaps Elizabeth had slipped past his defenses so smoothly that any resistance he might have felt was disregarded. If someone had asked him yesterday if he was seeking a relationship, he would have confidently said no, content with his current situation and feeling no need for romance. He had great friends at work, both male and female, and had a friendly relationship with his ex-wife, so he felt no urgent need for anything more. But now, upon reflection, he did want more. He had sensed something special about Elizabeth from their first meeting during her job interview, although he hadn't admitted it then. It wasn't any one thing that attracted him. It was the totality of who Elizabeth was. They had become great friends, and now that romance had entered the equation, he could see how beneficial it could be. He knew what she liked and disliked because they had shared their preferences with each other. He didn't have to worry about tonight being a nerve-wracking experience of probing safe topics, as they had already discussed those and some more challenging ones, enjoying their conversations even when they didn't always agree. He realized he wanted to be with her when they were apart and felt happier than he had in a long time when they were together. So, tonight wouldn't be as awkward as a typical first date, especially for someone his age. Although he hadn't dated in over 20 years and the thought usually terrified him, he felt at ease knowing he was going out with a friend. What did concern him were the physical aspects of a relationship. He hadn't kissed another woman since before his marriage. It wasn't the mechanics of kissing that worried him, but the fear of disappointing her due to lack of experience. He hoped it would come back to him like riding a bike. Since Elizabeth had been patiently waiting for him, he planned to follow her lead and take cues from her about what she wanted. One thing he was sure of was that he wasn't ready for physical intimacy yet. He would need to take baby steps to feel comfortable. He also doubted that Elizabeth would want to rush into bed on the first date, as it wasn't her style, so he set that thought aside for a future consideration. Arch arrived in front of Elizabeth's condo at 7:25 p.m. After checking his tie in the mirror and ensuring it was straight, he got out of the car and headed to her door. Taking a deep breath, he double-checked the flowers he was holding before ringing the bell. Moments later, The door swung open, and the sight that greeted him left him speechless. Elizabeth had styled her hair in a way he had never seen before, but hoped to see more often. Her dress, the classic little black dress, clung to her curves and ended just above her knees. She completed the look with a simple pearl necklace, matching earrings and bracelet, and shiny black high heels. In short, she was a vision of elegance. Realizing he might be staring, Arch handed her the bouquet of flowers before speaking. "Wow, Elizabeth, you look amazing. These are for you." Elizabeth had also taken the opportunity to assess Arch and was pleased with the reaction she had evoked. She had put considerable effort into her appearance tonight, and it had clearly paid off. "You look great yourself, Arch. I love that suit, and these flowers are beautiful. Please come in while I find a vase for them." She led him to the living room and invited him to sit on the couch. Once he was comfortable, she quickly retrieved a vase from the kitchen, filled it with water, arranged the flowers, and placed the vase on the coffee table in front of him. When she returned, Arch stood up, almost pinching himself in disbelief. He still couldn't quite believe that this stunning woman was the same person he worked with every day. Although she was attractive at work, she usually toned down her appearance. Tonight, she had opted for something more striking, and the difference was astonishing. Checking his watch, Arch noted that it was time to head out if they wanted to make their reservations. "I hate to rush, but we should get going now, Elizabeth." "Of course, just let me grab my wrap and we'll be on our way." She picked up her wrap from a chair, and Arch helped her drape it over her shoulders. After she locked the door, he extended his arm and escorted her to his car. The drive to the restaurant was swift, and they soon found themselves seated at a quiet, secluded table in a cozy corner. "This place looks charming, architect. Do you come here often?" "Actually, yes. I've been frequenting this spot for business meetings since it opened about a year ago. I really appreciate the food and the privacy the seating offers. As long as people don't speak too loudly, you can't hear much from other tables." "I think the atmosphere is very romantic," she said with a playful smile. "Well, now that you mention it, it is quite romantic." "I hope you like it," Arch asked with a hopeful glance. "Oh, I do, Arch. I most definitely do." At that moment, the waiter arrived, took their drink orders, and left them to look over the menu. He returned with their drinks, took their dinner orders, and departed just as quickly. "You mentioned dancing after dinner, Arch. I haven't danced since Joe's retirement party, and I'm looking forward to it." "You dance very well, if I remember correctly," she said, with a hint of flirtation. "They have dancing here in the lounge area starting at 9 o'clock. Arch paused, reflecting on her previous comment. "Has it really been that long? I apologize, and I promise you won't have to wait another 6 months before I take you dancing again. You can count on that," he chuckled. "I'll hold you to that, you know. I just love to dance, so much so that you might regret making that promise." Arch smiled warmly and replied in a low, sultry voice, "I'm willing to take that chance, Elizabeth." His words sent a shiver of excitement down her spine. Arch had never spoken to her like this before, and she found it thrilling. She reached out and took his hand, her eyes darkening as her desire for him became more apparent. Arch noticed the change in Elizabeth almost immediately after he spoke. He could practically feel the warmth emanating from her, and her eyes revealed a previously hidden yearning for him. Instead of being taken aback by the intensity of her feelings, he was pleased, and it ignited his own desires. It had been many years since he felt such longing, and he found himself enjoying the sensation. For the first time since his divorce, he felt truly alive. Elizabeth was awakening emotions he had suppressed for too long, and it felt exhilarating to let them out once more. These emotions passed between them silently, and just as Arch was about to kiss Elizabeth, their meals arrived. Disrupted from their intimate bubble, they leaned back, blushing, and began their meal. Conversation naturally slowed during dinner, and after dessert, they moved to the lounge, securing an empty table near the dance floor. Arch ordered a bottle of wine, and they settled in while waiting for the band to finish setting up. Arch poured them each a glass of wine, raised his glass, and proposed a toast. "To best friends," he said softly, gazing deeply into her eyes. "To best friends," she responded warmly, and they sipped their wine. The evening was spent dancing, savoring the feel of each other's arms. As the first song ended, Arch and Elizabeth shared their first kiss. Arch's concerns about disappointing Elizabeth due to his inexperience were quickly dispelled as his lips met hers, eliciting a sensual moan from her even before his tongue sought entry. He deepened the kiss, holding her tightly as she felt her knees go weak. She returned the kiss with enthusiasm, but all too soon it ended, leaving her breathless as he pulled away. "Wow," she said, overwhelmed and unable to think clearly. Arch smiled affectionately. "Wow, I was worried about doing that. I didn't want to embarrass myself with my inexperience." "If that's what you call inexperience, Arch, I'm not sure I can handle you once you're fully confident. You won't hear any complaints from me if your kisses never get any better." "Thank you, Elizabeth. Your kisses bring out the best in me, so I'm sure my partner plays a big role in my performance." He pulled her closer as the next song began. She nestled against his chest while he rested his cheek on her hair, inhaling her perfume, which intoxicated him and intensified his feelings for her. Throughout the night, they spent more time on the dance floor than off it, but still managed to finish the bottle of wine during the band's breaks. Before long, the band leader announced that the next set would be the last, and they made the most of it, dancing every dance. By the end of the evening, they felt as though they had known each other forever and were familiar with each other's bodies as much as they could be with their clothes on. Given the heat they had generated throughout the night, Arch was concerned that his resolve to avoid intimacy tonight might be tested. Although he was quickly falling for Elizabeth, he didn't want to rush things. He wanted her to know that his feelings were genuine and not just about physical attraction. Trusting what he knew of Elizabeth, he felt confident she wouldn't press the issue tonight and was reassured by that thought. Elizabeth was also contemplating the next step of the evening. She felt they had made significant progress and sensed Arch's desire in everything he did, especially in the way he held her while dancing and kissing. No man had ever kissed her like that, and those kisses deepened her love for him. However, she wondered if he might expect more now that she had stirred his desire. She was looking forward to more, just not tonight. She had never been the type to sleep with someone on the first date, and she wasn't about to start now, no matter how much Arch turned her on. Knowing Arch as she did, she was sure he would understand her reluctance to take that step tonight. With that settled, they relaxed as they made their way to her condo, hand in hand, each lost in their own thoughts. Parking in front of her condo, Arch moved to the other side of the car and opened the door for her. Gently pulling her closer, they walked to her door, sharing light kisses every few steps. When they reached her door, he turned her to face him, gazing deeply into her eyes before kissing her with a fervor that conveyed all his feelings for Elizabeth. This kiss was more intense than any they had shared on the dance floor, and he reluctantly pulled away, breathless. Reaching up to brush her cheek, he smiled and kissed her forehead. "I hate to leave you, but if I stay any longer, I might end up doing something neither of us is quite ready for. I've had such a fantastic time, and I don't want to spoil it by pushing things too far on our first date. I hope you understand, honey." Honey? He had never used an endearment before, but she found she liked it. She agreed and tried to reassure him. "I agree, darling. I've had a wonderful evening, and it feels right to end it here. Thank you for being the man I hoped you'd be." "Darling?" Arch had worried she might not appreciate the term of endearment, but not only did she accept it, she gave one in return. His heart soared, knowing he had made the right choice and that she felt the same. Kissing her once more, though less passionately than before, he pulled back and held her hands. "I'll call you tomorrow, Elizabeth, if that's okay." "I'd like that very much, Arch." He released her hands and headed home, replaying the night in his mind until he fell asleep, dreaming of the best date he'd ever had. Elizabeth woke up early the next morning, her mind full of memories of yesterday's date. It exceeded all her expectations, especially considering that just the day before, she and Arch were still officially just friends. Dressing in her most alluring lingerie to prolong the sensations she was feeling, she added a blouse and shorts before heading to the kitchen to prepare breakfast, while the coffee brewed. She attempted to read the newspaper as she ate, but soon abandoned it, her thoughts consumed by the previous night's memories and the sensation of Arch in her arms, his lips on hers. Her reverie was interrupted by the ringing of the telephone. "Hello?" she answered, hoping it would be Arch. "Good morning, Elizabeth," came the smooth, familiar voice she had been longing to hear. "How are you this morning? Did you sleep well?" "I slept like a baby, Arch. I'm so glad you called early. I really wanted to hear your voice," she replied shyly. "I'm glad you feel that way because I was concerned it might be too early, but I couldn't wait any longer." He hesitated briefly before continuing. "Would you like to go on a picnic in the mountains today? I know a charming little meadow just a short walk from the main trail. I'd love to show it to you." A picnic in a meadow, just us? Oh, yes. I'd love that, Arch. How did you know I enjoy mountain walks? You mentioned it once, and I remembered it while planning our day. I've almost finished preparing the food. I just needed your confirmation. I can be over in about an hour. Does that work for you? Oh, Arch, I could have made the food myself, but I appreciate your effort. An hour sounds perfect. I have a bottle of wine I can bring if you don't mind. That would be wonderful. I don't have any wine at the moment. See you in an hour then. Bye, honey. Bye, Arch. See you soon. Arch lay on his back, staring up at the sky, lost in his thoughts. He could hardly believe that this was not a dream. He was so overwhelmed with happiness. There was a beautiful woman next to him, and they had reciprocity. They were alone in a secluded meadow, the sun warming their skin. They had just enjoyed the dish he had prepared and the wine she had brought, and now they relaxed in the pleasant silence they shared. They kissed, hugged, caressed, did everything like lovers. He looked down at her, meeting her gaze. The contented expression on her face was the same as his, and he couldn't help but feel like the happiest person in the world. I do not know if this is the best moment or the most appropriate place, but I need you to know something, Elizabeth. I love you. I know I didn't realize it right away, but last night and today opened my eyes. I'm just sorry it took me so long to figure it out, he said, slightly lowering his eyes. Elizabeth felt her eyes fill with tears at his words. True, lying in the middle of a field might not be the most romantic place to say them, but the emotions behind them warmed her heart. She understood why he needed to say it now. These 3 words have never sounded so perfect, no matter the situation. Oh, Archie, I love you too. She quickly got down on her knees and snuggled up to him and kissed him. Their lips pressed together, their hands wandered, and their desire began to grow again. No matter how much I want to make this moment longer, I already want to be in bed with you. Come on, get dressed while I pack our things, he said with excitement in his voice. You're so cute, baby. Let's get ready. A few minutes later, they were walking back to the car, walking quickly but cautiously to the nearest pharmacy. Arch rushed inside, grabbed the first protection box he saw, and returned to the car before. The trip to her house seemed endless. They looked at each other all the way. By the time they arrived, Elizabeth's hands were shaking so much that she couldn't even open the door. Once inside, he pressed her against the door and started kissing her. It was great. They were making real love. They rested in silence for a few minutes, too exhausted to speak, but expressing their love with gentle touches. Arch wasn't sure, but maybe he even dozed off for a moment. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Elizabeth looking at him with a satisfied smile. Did I fall asleep? Archie asked, feeling a little embarrassed. "Just for a few minutes. I don't mind. You've worked hard and you deserve a little sleep," she said. "I just don't want to be the kind of guy who makes love and then rolls over and falls asleep. I enjoy the feeling of intimacy almost as much as the intimacy itself," he mused. "Trust me, we had a great aftertaste before you took a little nap. What do you think all those hugs were for?" she asked with a playful smile. Elizabeth looked into Arch's eyes and saw in them a reflection of the love he felt for her, which brought tears to her eyes. She choked a little, and tears flowed down her cheeks. Seeing the tears, Arch became worried. "Honey, are you okay?" "What is it?" he asked cautiously. Elizabeth dabbed at her tears with the back of her hand and nestled into his chest, cradling his head in her hands and showering his face with kisses. She gently kissed the tip of his nose before pulling back slightly. "I'm more than okay, darling. It's just been so long since I felt like this. So long since someone told me they loved me. I guess I was a bit overwhelmed. Please don't worry. I'm so happy I could burst. I love you, Arch. I love you so much, and I thank God that you came into my life. I should be the one thanking God for bringing you to me. I never thought I could feel this way about a woman again after—" He trailed off, not wanting to elaborate. "Shh, I understand. You don't need to say more. I felt the same way. After my breakup with my husband, I lost hope of finding another man I could love. I was sure I could never trust another man after what he did, and for years, I didn't even try. As time passed and no one I met sparked my interest, I figured all the good ones were taken and stopped looking. Even when I met you and started feeling those old emotions again, I didn't take them seriously because you didn't seem interested," she said softly. "I wasn't," he admitted regretfully. "I guess I was still too hurt to make the effort. It took me a while to get out of my rut. I'm just glad you didn't give up on me. I can be pretty thick-headed at times, and I shudder to think of what I might have missed if you'd decided I wasn't going to come around. You never needed to worry about that. I knew you were worth the wait, and since I'd been alone for 10 years, giving you time to come to your senses wasn't a hardship," she said with a playful grin. "Come to my senses, huh?" He laughed. "Well, I suppose that's what it was. I still have to thank Bill for opening my eyes. I don't know how much longer I would have remained oblivious without his nudging." "It wouldn't have been too long, Arch. I was planning to be a bit more obvious about my feelings soon anyway. I was coming home with wet panties too many nights to let it drag on much longer," she said with a smile. Once again, he felt incredibly grateful that he had met such a wonderful woman. After that, Elizabeth fell down next to Arch, and he hugged her. When sleep began to overwhelm him, he reached for the sheet, pulled it over them, and they both fell asleep in this embrace. The relationship between Arch and Elizabeth progressed rapidly after their first day together. They spent most of their free time at each other's homes, enjoying each other's company and doing all the things that couples in love do when they are alone. At this stage in his life, Arch felt he knew himself well, and he believed he understood Elizabeth just as deeply, so it wasn't long before thoughts of marriage crossed his mind. He chose a ring he was confident she would love, and made arrangements with the jeweler for an exchange if necessary. He also made a reservation at the restaurant where they had their first date. They were seated at the same table and engaged in lively conversation throughout the meal. After finishing dessert, and before heading to the lounge for dancing, Arch reached into his pocket and pulled out a small blue box. Dropping to one knee in front of her, he opened the box. Looking straight into her eyes, he asked, "Will you marry me, Elizabeth?" Seeing the beautiful ring sparkling in the box, Elizabeth's heart raced. She had to swallow a few times before she could speak. "Yes, oh yes, I will marry you, Arch," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around his neck and hugging him so tightly he thought she might break it. He took the ring from the box and placed it on her finger where it fit perfectly. Their moment was interrupted by applause from the surrounding diners, which they acknowledged while blushing. They then made their way to the lounge, where they discovered a bucket of champagne waiting at their table, courtesy of the management. The rest of the evening flew by, and they left early to continue their celebration at her place. Arch woke early that Saturday morning, the light from the window filtering around the shade. He reflected on the past few months and still couldn't quite believe his luck. After the dismal years of his marriage and the dark times following the divorce, he never imagined he'd find such happiness again. He felt truly fortunate that love had come to him twice in his life. However, one thing tempered his joy. He needed to inform Dee about his engagement, and he wasn't looking forward to it. He knew he had to tell her in person. He owed her that much, after all they had been through together, sensing that she still harbored some hope they might reconcile one day. Although she never mentioned anything like that during their occasional lunches or when he saw her at Bernie and Deborah's events, he could perceive what he interpreted as hope in her eyes, especially when she talked to her sister in a way he could see but not hear. He hated to cause her pain with this news, but also didn't want her to hear it secondhand. It had to be done, and it needed to be done soon. On Monday at work, Elizabeth would likely mention it to her friends, and the news would be out. He sighed and continued staring at the ceiling. Elizabeth woke slowly, glancing at her left hand where Arch had placed the ring the night before. It still felt like a dream to her, and she was reluctant to move. Hearing a sigh from the man beside her, she turned her head to see Arch staring at the ceiling, clearly lost in thought. "Morning, darling. Is something wrong?" she asked gently. Arch glanced over at his fiancée, noticing the concern etched on her face. He needed to reassure her quickly. "No, sweetheart. Everything's fine. I was just contemplating something I need to do that I'm not looking forward to. I have to let Dee know about our upcoming marriage," he said gently. "Oh?" she inquired, her curiosity evident. "Yeah. I feel like I owe it to her. We spent a lot of years together and she shouldn't find out through the grapevine. I just don't know how to approach it. How do you tell your ex-wife you're getting remarried? 'Hi, Dee, congratulations, I'm getting married.' I'm not sure what to say," he admitted with a sigh. "You're a good man, Arch. Most guys wouldn't even think about their ex-wife's feelings. You'll come up with a way to break the news as gently as possible. I know you will." "Thanks for the encouragement, sweetheart. I'll need the moral support. I'm planning to call her later today and invite her to lunch tomorrow if that's okay with you." "Of course, no problem. I'll have you for the rest of the day and the rest of our lives, so I can spare you for lunch tomorrow. I think I'll ask Joy to join us too. I can't wait until Monday to share the news." "That sounds great, Elizabeth. Just ask Joy to keep it quiet until Monday. I want to enjoy a peaceful Sunday afternoon with you before everyone finds out. You know it'll be non-stop once the news spreads. By the way, do you have any thoughts on when you'd like the ceremony?" "Well, Arch, I haven't had much chance to think about it. You proposed last night, and then we spent the rest of the night dancing and making love. My mind has been a bit occupied," she said with a playful smile. "Sorry, sweetheart. I just thought I'd ask since it crossed my mind. Personally, the sooner the better, so whatever suits you works for me." "I'll give it some thought and let you know, darling. Care to join me in the shower?" she said with a grin that suggested more than just a bath. "I'll be right there, baby. I'll wash your back, and a few other things." At 12:55, Arch sat at a stylish outdoor cafe, glancing at his watch for the third time in just 3 minutes, feeling like time was dragging. As he checked his watch again, he saw the maitre d' leading Dee to his table. He stood and pulled out a chair for her. Once he was seated again, he began. "Thanks for coming, Dee. I really appreciate you meeting me on such short notice," he said, his nervousness more evident than he had hoped. Dee noticed the tension in his face and heard it in his voice, which made her worried. Despite their time apart, she still knew him well enough to sense he had something important to say that she probably wouldn't like. With a forced smile, she wondered what it could be. No problem, Arch. I always enjoy our lunches together, she replied. Assuming the news wasn't good, she decided to address it quickly. You seem nervous, Arch. Did I do something? Dee's ability to read his anxiety and her desire to get straight to the point surprised him. No, Dee. It's not about anything you've done. I have something to tell you, and I didn't want you to hear it from someone else. I owe you that much. He paused, looked into her eyes, and took a deep breath to steady himself before continuing. I'm getting married, Dee. Married. He's getting married, she thought. This was the last thing she expected to hear today. Despite her best efforts to move on, she had secretly hoped Arch might reconsider and come back to her. Deborah had mentioned it frequently, suggesting Arch just needed time to get over the hurt she had caused him. Once he moved past that, he would miss her and see how much she had changed, becoming more like the woman he had once loved rather than the shrew he divorced. Her hopes had been slightly revived when they renewed their friendship, even though Arch had clearly defined their relationship. Now, those hopes were shattered, and she struggled to hold back tears. She had done this to herself, and worse, she had done it to him. Her hurt had overshadowed his love for her. Realizing she had been silent for too long, she decided she should congratulate him, even though it was the last thing she wanted to do. Reaching across the table, she placed her hand on his. Congratulations, architect. I'm genuinely happy for you. So, who's the lucky woman? Arch noticed that despite her calm demeanor, Dee was clearly upset, which wasn't unexpected. As he had suspected, she had hoped for a reconciliation, and now that hope was gone. Although he was happy with his own situation, he still felt sympathy for her. Her name is Elizabeth Cann. She's the CFO at the medical center. We've been dating for a while, and I felt it was time to move forward with my life, but I wanted to tell you first. Thank you for being considerate of my feelings, Arch. You've always been worried about me, even when I didn't deserve it. You're a wonderful man, Arch, and my biggest regret is losing you due to my own mistakes. She felt tears well up, but refused to let them fall, not wanting to upset Arch further. She briefly lowered her head to collect herself. So, when's the wedding? And will I be invited? She asked with a forced smile. We haven't set a date yet, but yes, you're invited if you'd like to come, he replied softly. I would like to, Arch. You've been good to me over the years, and as your friend, I want to share in your happiness, she said sincerely. Arch had been curious about something for a long time, and this seemed like the right moment to ask. Dee, may I ask you a personal question? You can ask, but I might not answer depending on how personal it is. That's fair. He paused, looking into her eyes to convey his sincerity. Dee, why did you end your engagement to that British guy? I've always wondered. You seemed so happy in the photo of you two in the paper. This was a question Dee had not anticipated at all. Should she reveal the truth? Yes, he deserved to know, especially given his thoughtfulness in considering her feelings. It's a bit complicated, Arch. At first, I was really taken by Trevor. He was incredibly charming and confident. I met him a few weeks ago at a party Deborah dragged me to. We were introduced, and he seemed quite interested in me, spending the rest of the evening with me. We saw each other almost every day after that. Being wealthy, Trevor took me to the finest restaurants, extravagant parties, and showered me with expensive gifts. I was, to say the least, overwhelmed. Deborah thought he was perfect for me and insisted that I'd be a fool to stop seeing him, she said, taking a sip of water. His proposal at that party was a total surprise as well. Everyone was congratulating me and seemed so genuinely happy that I didn't give the situation much thought before saying yes. That was when the photographer took the picture that ended up in the paper. It was only the next day that reality hit me. I didn't really know Trevor well enough. He was a lovely man, handsome, and certainly a good match, but I didn't love him. It might sound strange, but I had been in love before, and this wasn't the same, she said, her voice wavering. Taking a deep breath, She lifted her head, squared her shoulders, and continued. Once I realized that, the decision was clear. I called Trevor that day and told him I was sorry but couldn't marry him. He was heartbroken because he truly loved me, having fallen in love at first sight. I told him I didn't feel the same way. He asked if I thought I could eventually grow to love him, and he was willing to wait. I was honest and told him no. I didn't think I could ever love him, and it wouldn't be fair to keep him waiting. I used the excuse of not wanting to move to England with my friends since that hadn't come up before I said yes, but Trevor knew the real reason. He went back to England the following week, and I haven't seen him since. I'm sorry to hear that, Dee. You deserve to find love too. I hope you find someone who truly loves you soon. Arch gently squeezed the hand she had placed over his earlier, conveying his empathy and his desire for her to find happiness. To lighten the mood, he signaled the waiter, and they continued their lunch as the friends they were. Arch stood at the front of the church with Bernie Green, waiting for his bride to arrive. He glanced out at the gathering of friends and family, acknowledging their presence with nods as their eyes met. He was both surprised and pleased to see that Dee had evidently brought a date. The seriousness of it didn't concern him. He was simply glad to see Dee moving forward and dating again. His focus shifted to the back of the church as the wedding march began to play. There stood his stunning bride on her father's arm. As the music filled the air, she walked down the aisle toward him and the future they would share together.